Today, I'll be talking about a large-scale multi-site replication study examining the relationship between musical training and sound neural coding and perception. The 6 sites involved in this data collection are listed here. Music is interesting in part because it's universal. Every human society has music. This has led some scientists to ask whether there are benefits in musical training that extend beyond the enjoyment of music. Does musical training strengthen the brain? Evidence so far suggests musicians outperform non-musicians on measures that are directly relevant to practicing a musical instrument, such as melody discrimination, fine-grained motor coordination, and pitch discrimination. Some other evidence suggests musicians may also have an advantage for speech perception and background sounds. This is especially important because speech and noise perception becomes worse with both aging and sensory neural hearing loss, and it cannot readily be reintroduced by assistive listening devices like hearing aids. Such perceptual advantages tend to co-occur with neural musician advantages. One of the most studied ones is the frequencies following response. This is a scalp-recorded electrical response that reflects the fidelity of encoding periodic sounds. Musicians have been found to have faster onset and transition responses to speech stimuli, as well as stronger spectral encoding to speech sounds in noise. This is especially true for the upper harmonics in noise. But there are several reasons to be cautious about both the robustness and the magnitude of the musician advantage. First is a small samples problem. Most studies in the literature have been conducted on relatively small sample sizes, conducted on extreme ends of the musical spectrum, comparing highly trained musicians versus people with limited or no musical training at all. These participants tend to be young college-age listeners, although a growing number of studies have been done on aging adults. And so this calls into question the generalizability of a musician advantage if it's present. Do you need to be a professional musician to see the advantage, or does it vary continuously with 4 years of formal musical training? Third, and most importantly, these are cross-sectional studies, so correlation is not causation. Just because you find a musician advantage doesn't mean that it's a training that's necessarily causing the advantage. That can only be identified by conducting longer, more arduous studies, training studies where you randomly assign people to musical training or not. These are quite expensive and arduous, and so it makes sense to first see if there's an advantage in cross-sectional studies before such longitudinal studies are conducted. And that's where we aim to come in, is by conducting a large-scale replication and extension, where we are replicating 8 of the most seminal musician advantages on a large group of over 300 participants that are varying in both age, ages 18 to 89, and years of formal musical training. Today, we'll be talking about 3 of these advantages: pitch discrimination, speech perception, and spectral encoding for the upper harmonics. Before I show you our data so far, I want to caveat that data collection is ongoing and any results are very preliminary. And so formal statistical analyses will be conducted once data collection is complete. Pitch discrimination task, we presented participants 2 sequences of tones, one at a time. And participants had to say which one was changing in F0, their complex tones. And so we measured the smallest change in F0 they could perceive at threshold, which is plotted here on the y-axis. Lower is better performance. Non-musicians on the left and musicians on the right. And you can see a general trend for musicians to perform better than non-musicians, although there's a wide amount of variability in the non-musician group, consistent with published literature. When we compare years of formal musical training as a continuous variable, we get information that we can't see by comparing the extreme ends. And that's only a little bit of musical training seems to be associated with the musician advantage until participants reach their best performance. Next, for speech and babble, we used a quick speech and noise test. Participants heard 1 female talker amongst multi-talker babble, and they had to report back the words that they heard. From that, we calculated a signal-to-noise ratio, or SNR. Lower on the y-axis corresponds to better performance. And you can see quite a bit of overlap between both the musician and non-musician group. Not much trend for a musician advantage yet. And this is also the case when looking across 200 participants that are varying in their years of formal musical training. Lastly, for spectral encoding to the upper harmonics, we presented participants with the phoneme da, amongst to multi-talk or babble, and they passively attended while the sounds were presented, and we recorded their frequency following responses. Parbury-Clark et al. 2009 found musicians had an advantage for encoding the upper harmonics in babble, but not the F0. When we look at F0 encoding, we find results consistent, qualitatively consistent with Parbury-Clark et al., where there's no real difference between the groups so far. However, we also see no real trend for a musician advantage so far in encoding the upper harmonics in babble. But to clarify, all the data is preliminary, so we can't make any firm conclusions yet. Once data collection is complete, this will be the largest study on this topic of musicianship with both neural and perceptual measures. And all of our resources are open. Our code is on GitHub and our pre-registered protocols available if you'd like to learn more. Thanks to our funding sources, and thanks to you for listening.